Jamal could feel the pulse of his own heart in his throat as he walked through the city streets, the weight of every glance that lingered just a little too long, every whispered comment that barely grazed his ears but still stung deep inside. He had grown up with it, this quiet, insidious form of violence. The everyday racism that no one spoke of aloud, but that was ever present in the way people looked at him, moved away when he passed, or watched him a little too closely when he entered a store. It was always there, a shadow he couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried. He was just a teenager, but his world felt far older than it should. Each step was a negotiation with the world around him, his mind constantly racing to assess threats and navigate the spaces where he didn't belong. He wasn't just Jamal, he was a symbol of everything people feared and misunderstood. Today, though, he had a sense of urgency, something pulling him forward. His mom, Dr. Simone Richardson, had called earlier. She needed him to meet her at the courthouse after school. He had been looking forward to it, even if it meant rushing through the streets. He was proud of her. She was a judge, a woman who had earned her place with blood, sweat, and tears, not just because of her skill but because of her relentless fight against a world that had tried to push her down for every ounce of her success. She was a beacon for him, a reminder that no matter how hard the world tried to break him, he had to keep pushing. Jamal's shoes echoed against the pavement as he walked faster, brushing his hand through his curly hair, feeling the familiar knot of tension creep into his shoulders. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows across the sidewalk, and as he walked past the upscale cafes and fancy boutiques, the sting of inequality hit him again. He could feel the eyes on him, the way people's gazes flicked away just as quickly as they had met his own. No one ever really looked at him, they only ever saw the color of his skin. It was like that every day. But this was different. He had learned, over the years, to walk with his head held high, no matter the looks. No matter how many times he had to swallow back the words he wanted to say. But today, as he passed a small outdoor cafe with white umbrellas, something felt off. He had seen her before, a woman sitting outside sipping her latte, her eyes narrowed in judgment. There was no doubt in his mind, she was watching him. He felt it in the weight of her gaze, in the sharpness of her stare. Her name was Marissa Anderson. She had that kind of presence, rich, poised, and wrapped in a false sense of entitlement. She was the kind of person who looked at the world and saw only the reflection of herself in every corner. Her world was clean, sanitized from anything that challenged her perception. And Jamal, in her eyes, was a threat. He hadn't even done anything yet, but she had already decided who he was. She didn't have to know him. She didn't have to listen. She just had to look at him, and that was enough. As Jamal continued walking, trying to focus on the courthouse, he felt her eyes still on him. His stomach tightened. Just keep walking, he told himself, trying to push through. But when he reached the corner of the street, he heard her voice cut through the air. "Hey, you!" Jamal's heart skipped a beat, his entire body tensing as he slowly turned around. She was standing now, stepping toward him with a quickness that made his chest tighten. He could feel the tightness in his throat as if the air itself was being sucked out of him. "What do you think you're doing around here?" she asked, her voice sharp, laced with a kind of venom that he could taste on his tongue. It wasn't just a question. It was an accusation. She wasn't asking to understand, she was asking to condemn. Jamal's fists clenched at his sides, his breath coming in short bursts. This was it. He could feel the familiar wave of heat rise in his chest, the anger, the frustration, the raw emotion that always threatened to spill over when faced with this kind of unjust treatment. But he had learned to hold it back, to swallow it. To pretend it didn't hurt, even though it did, deeply. "I'm just walking through," he said, keeping his voice as even as he could. His eyes tried to meet hers, but she wasn't looking at him like a human being. She was looking at him as a problem to be solved, something that didn't fit into her neatly constructed world. Her lips curled into a sneer, and without another word, she pulled out her phone, her fingers tapping against the screen with practiced ease. Jamal's stomach dropped. He could already hear her next words before they left her mouth. "I'm calling the police. You need to leave now. I don't know what kind of trouble you're causing, but I'm not going to stand here and let you scare everyone." The words hit Jamal like a slap, his entire body going still. He had experienced this kind of thing before, of course. People had called the cops on him for just being in the wrong place, for simply existing. But this time, something about the way she spoke made it feel like a hammer smashing against the fragile remains of his sanity. His mouth went dry. He couldn't believe it. He had to get out of there. "Please, just leave me alone," he muttered, trying to turn away, to escape the suffocating weight of her presence. But she wasn't having it. She took another step forward, blocking his path. "Don't you walk away from me. I'm not done with you," she shouted. Jamal took a deep breath, his pulse pounding in his ears. "I'm not doing anything wrong," he shouted back, his voice cracking with frustration. He was done being silent. He was done being the one who had to swallow this, time and time again. His breath came fast now, each inhale sharp and jagged. The woman didn't back off. She had the look of someone who had never been told no. She had to win. She had to be in control. And then, as if summoned by some cruel twist of fate, the sound of sirens began to wail in the distance. They were getting closer. Jamal could hear them growing louder, more urgent, like the approach of a storm. His heart thudded against his ribs, and panic began to creep up his throat. He wasn't sure what was worse, the confrontation itself or the weight of knowing what would happen next. He had seen this before. He had seen the way cops treated people who looked like him, the way they always assumed the worst, no matter what. Marissa didn't notice the officer until he was already stepping out of his car. She immediately started talking, her voice dripping with self-righteousness. "This young man is causing a disturbance. He's up to something. I don't know what, but I'm not taking any chances." The officer, whose expression was cold and unreadable, turned his gaze toward Jamal. He didn't ask any questions. He didn't need to. He had already made up his mind. Jamal was the enemy. Jamal was the threat. The officer's eyes narrowed as he took a step toward Jamal, his hand already moving toward his belt. But then, in the midst of everything, something inside Jamal shifted. Something snapped. He couldn't keep taking this. He couldn't let this happen again. He took a breath, steadying himself, and with a calmness he hadn't known he possessed, he looked the officer in the eyes. "Do you know who my mother is?" he asked, his voice firm, challenging. The officer paused for a moment, his expression faltering. Marissa, too, turned toward him, her eyes widening as if the words hadn't quite registered yet. "My mom is Dr. Simone Richardson," Jamal continued, his tone now filled with an unspoken power. "She's a judge." There was a beat of silence, one pregnant with all the weight of the moment. For a split second, time stood still. The officer seemed to hesitate, as if he hadn't expected this turn of events. Marissa's face drained of color, the blood rushing from her cheeks. The certainty that had defined her from the moment she first laid eyes on Jamal was gone, replaced with something far less certain, fear. The officer looked between them, his mind racing as he quickly realized that everything about this situation had just changed. Jamal didn't need to say another word. He had already won. The moment those words left Jamal's mouth, the air seemed to thicken, like the whole street had just been drenched in silence. Marissa's face, once flushed with the fire of her judgment, now turned as pale as a sheet, her lips trembling slightly. The officer froze mid-step, his hand still hovering near his radio, but his focus entirely shifted from Jamal to the revelation that had just hit him like a freight train. Jamal's chest was heaving, his heart racing. His fingers tingled with the remnants of adrenaline as he took a slow, deliberate step forward, eyes locked on Marissa, whose expression shifted from self-assurance to something closer to dread. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. The realization had paralyzed her, and Jamal knew she could feel it, the weight of her own mistake pressing down on her. It wasn't just that she'd called the police on him, a young black man just trying to walk through the world. No, it was that she had underestimated him so thoroughly, assumed that because of his skin, he was somehow less than. And now, with one sentence, Jamal had turned her entire world upside down. You're lying." The words spilled from her lips before she could even stop herself. Her voice was shaky, uncertain. There was no longer any confidence behind her words. "There's no way." Jamal's eyes narrowed, the anger from earlier now replaced with a sharp, almost piercing calm. He wasn't lying. He had nothing to prove. The truth, in that moment, was enough. "I'm not lying." His voice was steady, unwavering, cutting through her panic like a blade. "I'm telling you, my mother is Dr. Simone Richardson." The officer, who had been too distracted by his own assumptions to think clearly, finally took a breath and cleared his throat. He glanced at Jamal, then at Marissa, as if weighing his next move. The sudden shift in the air, the fear that Jamal's words had planted in Marissa, was palpable. Jamal could see it, taste it. The officer's fingers, which had been itching to cuff him only moments ago, were now twitching nervously at his side, like he wasn't sure how to handle the new information. Marissa, trying desperately to regain control, straightened her posture, but it was as if her body had forgotten how to stand tall. Her usual poise had slipped away, leaving her exposed, vulnerable. I don't care who your mother is," she stammered, her words quick and sharp, but empty, like she was trying to convince herself more than anyone else. Jamal could feel the heat of her arrogance trying to come back, like a tidal wave crashing against the brittle edges of her dignity. But it wasn't working. Jamal wasn't the one being backed into a corner anymore. He was no longer the person who had to shrink, to apologize for simply existing. He wasn't the one who had to explain himself. The officer cleared his throat again, but this time it wasn't to give orders. It was more like he was struggling to reconcile the authority he had once thought was so solid beneath him with the cracks that Jamal's simple words had caused. I should probably call in." His voice was tentative now, no longer certain. He stepped back from Jamal, unsure, and for the first time, Jamal saw a hint of uncertainty in the officer's eyes. The weight of the badge no longer seemed so invincible. Marissa's eyes flicked between the officer and Jamal, her panic now bleeding through the cracks of her carefully curated persona. She had no idea how to handle this, how to handle being the one who was now under scrutiny, the one who was being forced to face the consequences of her own actions. "What do you mean call in?" Marissa demanded, the once smooth control in her voice now unraveling. "This is a child we're talking about." Her voice broke, and Jamal felt the rush of satisfaction that had been bubbling beneath his ribs finally surface. She had been the one to dehumanize him, to label him a threat based on nothing but his skin, but now she was the one trembling, trying to fight back the fear that was building in her chest. Jamal took a step toward her, his gaze unwavering. "It's you who should be called in, Marissa." He didn't even use her title, didn't give her the privilege of respect. She had lost that in his eyes. "You're the one who assumed I was guilty of something, just because of how I look." Her face reddened, her lips trembling as if she had just been slapped. But Jamal didn't feel sorry for her. She had to feel the weight of what she had done. She had to understand that the world didn't revolve around her, that her privilege didn't grant her the power to destroy others. "I didn't mean it like that," she cried, but even to her own ears, The words felt empty. I saw you, and I thought. You thought I was trouble, Jamal interrupted, his voice steady, cutting through her excuses like a knife. You thought because I'm black, I must be up to no good. You didn't think to ask. You didn't think to know who I was or what I was doing. There was a long silence after that. It stretched on, suffocating, thick with all the things that hadn't been said until now. Marissa couldn't seem to find the words to defend herself, couldn't seem to find a way to justify the way she had treated him. The officer, still standing behind them, looked as though he wanted to disappear into the pavement. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, unsure of how to proceed. He had assumed, just like Marissa had, and now the weight of his own bias hung over him like a shadow. Finally, it was Jamal who broke the silence, his voice calm but full of unspoken power. You can't undo what you've done, but at least learn from it. For once, try seeing me for who I am, not for what you want to believe. It was a challenge, a demand for something that went beyond an apology. He didn't just want her to say sorry. He wanted her to understand. He wanted her to confront the ugliness that had clouded her vision, and in doing so, maybe, just maybe, she would learn how to truly change. Marissa didn't respond right away. She stood there, like a woman who had just been stripped of everything she thought she knew about herself. She wasn't the one in control anymore. She wasn't the one with the upper hand. And as much as she wanted to scream, to push back, to make excuses, she couldn't. Instead, she took a deep breath, as if trying to gather some semblance of her former self. I'm sorry. The words came out so quietly that it felt like they had to be pulled from deep inside her, forced out from a place she hadn't even known existed. She didn't need his eyes, she couldn't. But the apology was there, raw and unpolished. Jamal didn't say anything at first. He didn't need to. He wasn't here to offer her forgiveness. He wasn't here to make her feel better. He was here to make her see the truth. To make her realize that the harm she had caused didn't just affect him, it reflected everything that was wrong with the world around them. The officer, now thoroughly uncomfortable, cleared his throat again, more awkwardly than before. I think we're done here. And with that, the moment passed. Jamal didn't look back. He didn't need to. As he walked away, the rush of emotions that had been building inside him for years seemed to settle, just a little. He didn't feel triumphant, not exactly. But he felt something close to peace. Something that was hard-won, something that had cost him every ounce of dignity just to get here. Marissa, left behind in the shadow of her own ignorance, finally slumped against the cafe's stone wall. She hadn't realized it before, but the control she thought she had over her world, over him, had been an illusion. And now, it was gone. Jamal walked away from the scene with a heavy heart, the sting of the confrontation still burning beneath his skin. His body moved automatically, each step feeling distant, as if he were outside of himself, watching the world spin around him in slow motion. The city sounds, the honking of cars, the chatter of pedestrians, the distant hum of traffic, seemed muffled, drowned out by the weight of what had just transpired. It wasn't just the confrontation with Marissa. It wasn't even the officer's hesitance, or the brief flicker of fear in her eyes. No, it was the realization that nothing in his life would ever be the same again. The world had just shifted. He had just shifted. It wasn't enough that he had stood up for himself, that he had made Marissa feel the weight of her prejudices. No. There was something deeper in him, a kind of emptiness, a deep ache that had been with him since he could remember. It was the ache of knowing that every day, every single day, he had to carry a burden no one else seemed to see. He was a person, a young man with dreams and fears, just like everyone else. But in the eyes of the world, he was always something else, something to be feared, something to be held at arm's length. And now, as he walked through the streets, a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. As Jamal rounded the corner, heading toward the courthouse where his mother had asked him to meet, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from her. "Where are you? I've been waiting." He paused, looking down at the message, the final remnants of the conversation with Marissa still swirling in his head. He quickly typed a reply. "On my way, just had something come up." His fingers trembled slightly as he hit send. He didn't want to talk about what had happened with Marissa, not yet. His mom was his rock, his steady force in a world that felt anything but stable. But today had cracked something inside him that he wasn't sure how to put back together. How could he tell her about the weight he'd been carrying all these years? How could he explain the exhaustion that had settled deep in his bones? Jamal entered the courthouse, the cool air hitting him like a wall as he passed through the large wooden doors. The building was vast, cold stone walls towering above him, echoing his footsteps as he made his way to the front. He saw his mother sitting on a bench by the entrance, her figure so familiar, yet somehow different today. She looked up at him as he approached, her expression unreadable at first. "Jamal," she said softly, standing up. There was a concern in her eyes, something that made his heart drop. "Hey, Mom." His voice felt hoarse, like the weight of everything he had been carrying was now coming out all at once. He had no idea how to explain to her the chaos that had unfolded only moments earlier. How could he put into words the anger, the fear, the pain? She must have seen it in his face, because without another word, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. The embrace was familiar, comforting, but today, it felt like something more, a lifeline in the midst of a storm he couldn't quite navigate. She pulled back, her eyes searching his face. "What happened? You're not yourself today." Jamal exhaled slowly, trying to steady himself. He didn't want to break down in front of her. He didn't want to let her see how shaken he was. She had fought her whole life to be where she was, to rise above the system that had tried to crush her. He didn't want to be another burden she had to bear, another reminder of how the world had failed them both. I had an encounter on my way here," he said, his voice shaking slightly despite his efforts to remain calm. He paused, trying to find the right words. "With someone who, well, she judged me. She assumed I was something I'm not, just because of the color of my skin." Simone's face hardened, and Jamal could see the flicker of recognition in her eyes. She didn't need to hear more. She understood all too well what that kind of judgment could do. "Tell me exactly what happened," she said quietly, her voice steady. She wasn't angry, at least not yet, but there was a quiet resolve in her tone, the kind that Jamal had always associated with her unwavering strength. Jamal took a deep breath and recounted the events, his words coming in bursts as he relived the confrontation. He could feel the tension in his muscles tighten as he spoke, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. When he reached the part about Marissa calling the police on him, Simone's eyes flashed with something darker, a mixture of disbelief and deep, unsettling pain. "She called the police?" Simone asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "After everything you've been through, she called the police on you?" Jamal nodded, his gaze falling to the floor. "Yeah, she did. I don't even think she realized what she was doing. But it didn't matter. I had to say something. I had to stand up for myself, Mom. I couldn't just let it slide anymore." Simone was quiet for a long moment, her eyes scanning his face as if searching for something. Jamal could see the wheels turning in her mind, weighing everything he had said, processing the painful familiarity of it. She had been through this, of course. Her entire life had been a series of battles against the forces that sought to diminish her, to make her feel less than. Finally, she spoke, her voice low but filled with conviction. "You did the right thing, Jamal. You didn't let her define you. You stood up for yourself, and I am so proud of you." But even as she spoke, Jamal couldn't help but feel a gnawing emptiness in his chest. He didn't feel proud. He didn't feel like a hero. He just felt tired. Tired of having to prove himself. Tired of fighting. Tired of being seen as something he wasn't. "I don't want to keep fighting, Mom," he whispered, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "I'm so tired of always having to explain myself, to prove that I'm not what people think I am. What if I'm just not enough?" Simone's expression softened, and she took his hand in hers, her grip firm but gentle. "You're more than enough, Jamal. You always have been. This world isn't built to make room for people like us, but that doesn't mean you're not worthy of space in it. You're worthy of everything you want, everything you deserve. Don't ever let anyone make you believe otherwise." Tears welled up in Jamal's eyes, and he tried to blink them away, but they came anyway, the dam he had been holding back for so long finally breaking. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," he choked out, the weight of everything he had endured crashing down on him. Simone pulled him into another hug, this time more urgent, as though she could shield him from the world with her own body. "You don't have to do it alone," she whispered. "You never have to do it alone." For the first time in what felt like forever, Jamal allowed himself to let go, to rest in the safety of his mother's arms. The road ahead was still long, but in that moment, he realized something important. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. And maybe that was enough to give him the strength to keep going. The comfort of his mother's arms didn't last as long as Jamal had hoped. He pulled away from her embrace, wiping the remnants of his tears from his cheeks. A fragile sense of peace lingered in the air, but some restless, gnawing feeling, was eating at him from the inside. He didn't want to leave her side, but the world outside their quiet moment was relentless, and he couldn't pretend it wasn't there anymore. He knew that what had happened with Marissa wasn't just an isolated incident. It wasn't something he could bury or simply move on from. The truth was, that encounter had cracked something open in him that he hadn't even realized was there. His mother, still holding onto his hand, sensed it too. She let go gently, her eyes steady as she studied his face. It wasn't like her to shy away from hard truths, and Jamal had learned long ago that when his mother's eyes looked like that, it meant she wasn't going to let him hide. "You can't keep carrying this alone, Jamal," Simone said, her voice quiet but firm. "The world has given you every reason to doubt yourself, but you don't have to let it win." Jamal's chest tightened at her words, his thoughts tangled in confusion and frustration. She had every right to tell him that, to remind him of the strength they shared. But something inside him resisted. "I don't know how much longer I can take it," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every day, it's like this battle, this fight just to exist. How do you keep going when you know they'll never see you for who you really are?" Simone stepped closer, her expression softening even further. "Because you have to, Jamal. We have to keep going. It's not about them seeing us for who we are. It's about us knowing who we are." But Jamal wasn't sure if that was enough anymore. How could it be when the world seemed determined to keep pushing him down, to treat him like something less? His mind spiraled back to Marissa, to the officer, to every single person who had looked at him and made assumptions based on nothing but the color of his skin. How could he stand tall in a world that constantly tried to break him? Simone placed a hand on his shoulder, grounding him, pulling him back to the present. "I know it's hard. But I've seen you grow into someone strong, someone who refuses to let their hate define you. And that strength? That's what they're afraid of." Jamal closed his eyes, trying to steady the whirlwind of thoughts. He hadn't felt strong in so long. What had happened with Marissa, her assumption, her accusation, her call to the police, had wounded him deeper than he cared to admit. He'd been so careful his entire life, so deliberate in trying to avoid trouble, in trying to prove that he wasn't a threat, that he was worth something. And yet, in a single instant, he had been reduced to a stereotype, to a criminal in someone's eyes, just because of how he looked. He had spent so much time trying to be better than what people thought of him. He had spent so much time trying to convince the world, and himself, that he deserved to be seen as more than just a young black man, that when it all came crashing down, it felt like everything he had worked for had been shattered. "I'm just tired, Mom." His voice was raw, the exhaustion in his soul finally finding its way to the surface. "I've tried so hard, but it's like no matter what I do, it's never enough." Simone's eyes filled with understanding, a sorrowful ache flickering in her gaze. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone, Jamal. You are enough. You always have been. But sometimes, it's not about winning the battle. It's about surviving it." Her words hit him like a ton of bricks. Survive it. The fight, the hate, the prejudice, it wasn't about winning. It was about enduring. It was about keeping his head above water long enough to see the other side. Jamal felt the weight of her words settle deep into his bones. He hadn't realized it, but he had been searching for an end to the pain, for a moment when everything would be okay, when the world would finally treat him with the respect he deserved. But that moment wasn't coming. Not anytime soon, at least. He stared at her, the ache in his chest refusing to subside, but there was something different now. A small shift. A flicker of understanding that hadn't been there before. He had to endure. Maybe that was the only way forward. It wasn't about changing the world in one fell swoop. It wasn't about making people like Marissa understand. It was about keeping his sense of self intact, no matter what the world threw at him. "I don't know if I can keep doing this." Jamal's voice faltered. "I don't know how to survive a world that wants to break me." Simone reached out again, taking his hand in both of hers this time. "You've already survived, Jamal. Every day, you've survived. The fact that you're still standing proves that you're stronger than all of them. You have nothing left to prove." There was a long pause as Jamal absorbed her words. The storm inside him hadn't passed, but something had changed. Simone was right. He had been surviving. Maybe it wasn't enough to change the world, but he was enough. He had always been enough. And maybe that was the key. Not to change the way people saw him, but to change how he saw himself. As he looked at her, something clicked inside him. For the first time in his life, he realized that his strength didn't come from proving his worth to others. It came from acknowledging it within himself. He didn't have to fight for validation. He already had it. "I'm not giving up," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I'm not going to let them take that from me." Simone smiled softly, the pride in her eyes radiating. "I knew you wouldn't." As they walked out of the courthouse together, side by side, Jamal felt the weight in his chest lighten, just a little. The world hadn't changed. It was still the same hostile, judgmental place it had always been. But now, Jamal understood something. He understood that he didn't have to fight against the world anymore. He didn't have to prove anything to it. He had already proven everything he needed to prove, just by existing. He wasn't going to let Marissa's hate, or anyone else's, dictate who he was. He was more than what they saw. He was more than the labels they tried to put on him. And for the first time, he truly believed it. As they left the courthouse, Jamal felt a quiet strength building inside him. It wasn't about winning. It wasn't about making the world see him as human. It was about holding onto his humanity, no matter how hard the world tried to take it away. And no matter what happened next, Jamal knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let them break him. Not now. Not ever. The days following the encounter with Marissa felt like they moved in slow motion, each one blending into the next with a heavy, oppressive weight. Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in him, like the fragile balance he'd been maintaining was slowly starting to crumble. He'd tried to bury the pain, the anger, even the sense of humiliation. But it was impossible to ignore the slow burn of injustice that lingered inside him, demanding attention, forcing him to face it every time he looked in the mirror. He went through the motions of his life, school, work, the occasional gathering with friends, but each interaction felt empty. He wasn't the same person he had been before Marissa had called the police on him. There was a part of him now, a darker, more bitter part, that questioned everything. Was he really free? Was he truly accepted in the world? Or was he just waiting for the next incident to remind him that, to some, he would always be the other? It was on a Tuesday afternoon, a week after the courthouse meeting with his mother, when Jamal's world was rocked again. He had been sitting in his car, parked at the edge of a small park, when his phone buzzed. He looked down at the screen, expecting another message from his mom or a reminder for work. But it was from someone he hadn't expected, Marissa. "We need to talk." Jamal stared at the message for a moment, the words sinking in. He felt a knot tighten in his stomach, a surge of adrenaline that rushed through him. Why now? Why after everything that had happened? Was she expecting an apology? Was she going to try to manipulate him into forgiving her? Before he could stop himself, his fingers were already moving, typing a reply. "There's nothing to talk about." He hit send, but the message didn't feel right. It felt like he was closing the door on something he wasn't ready to close yet. There was something inside him, a small voice that wanted to understand why Marissa had done what she did, why she had assumed the worst about him and treated him like a criminal, why she had turned on him so easily. His phone buzzed again almost immediately. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I'm sorry. Can we meet?" Jamal hesitated. He wasn't sure what kind of game she was playing, but he wasn't ready to let her off the hook. Yet, there was a part of him that wanted answers. Deep down, he needed to understand why. Why her, of all people? Why the woman who had been so eager to call the police on him, to make him feel like an enemy, a threat? His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment, then he typed back. "Fine. Where?" She suggested a quiet cafe on the edge of town, one he'd passed by 100 times but never stopped in. It was a small, nondescript place, nothing special, the kind of cafe where people came and went without much attention. Jamal didn't know what to expect when he walked through the door, but his heart was pounding as he stepped into the dimly lit room. Marissa was already there, sitting at a table by the window. She was alone, her face pale, her expression unreadable. Jamal couldn't help but notice how different she looked in person compared to the last time they'd spoken. The confidence she had exuded earlier, the smugness of someone who knew she could get away with anything, was gone. In its place was something else, something more vulnerable, more human. She looked up as he approached, and for a moment, there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes. It was as though she didn't quite know how to face him, didn't quite know what to say. He stood there for a moment, just staring at her, before finally sitting down across from her. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with uncertainty. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the cafe, the clinking of coffee cups, the quiet murmur of other patrons, seemed distant, almost surreal, as Jamal waited for her to say something. Anything. But she just sat there, her hands clenched tightly on the table, her lips trembling as if she were holding something back. "Why?" Jamal finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't just a question about the incident at the park. It was a question about everything. About why she had called the police, why she had assumed the worst of him, why she had been so eager to bring the weight of the law down on him when he hadn't done anything wrong. Marissa's eyes darted to the side, avoiding his gaze. For a moment, Jamal thought she wasn't going to answer, that she would try to deflect, try to make excuses. But then, her voice came, soft and hesitant. "I don't know," she said, her words breaking the silence. "I was scared. I was scared because of everything I've been taught, everything I've seen. I don't know where it comes from. I panicked." Jamal stared at her, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what he expected, but it certainly wasn't this raw, almost fragile admission of guilt and fear. For a moment, he wanted to lash out, to tell her how wrong she was, to make her understand the depth of the harm she had caused. But something stopped him. Something inside him told him to listen. "You panicked?" Jamal asked, his voice shaking now, his anger bubbling beneath the surface. "And that's why you called the police on me? On someone you didn't even know?" Marissa nodded, her eyes welling with tears. "I didn't know what to do. I've always been told that people like you, black people, are dangerous. I didn't know how to deal with the situation, so I called for help. I thought I was doing the right thing." Jamal's heart twisted in his chest. He had heard these words before, but hearing them coming from her, someone who had seemed so normal, so relatable, just a few days ago, was almost too much to bear. The words were the same, but the tone was different. There was no malice behind them, no hatred. Just a deep, painful ignorance that had been instilled in her from a young age. "You don't understand," Jamal said, his voice low and thick with emotion. "You don't understand what it's like to live in this skin, to have people look at you like you're the enemy before you even say a word. You don't understand how exhausting it is to always be seen as a threat, no matter who you are or what you do." Marissa's tears spilled over then, her face crumpling as she finally looked at him, really looked at him. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she whispered. I didn't realize how deep it went." For a moment, Jamal just sat there, the words hanging in the air between them like a weight neither of them could lift. His mind was a whirlpool of anger, hurt, and confusion. But as he looked at her, something in him shifted. This wasn't about her, not entirely. It was about the system, the generations of lies and fear that had been passed down, the way people like Marissa had been taught to view him and others like him. He didn't forgive her, not yet, not completely. But he understood. And that understanding was enough to break through the anger, enough to give him a new perspective. He stood up, slowly, and looked down at her one last time. "You need to learn," he said, his voice hard, but not unkind. "We all do. But I'm not going to be your lesson. I'm not going to be the one you use to wake up from your ignorance." He turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving her sitting there, staring after him. He didn't know if she would change, if she would truly understand the damage she had caused. But in that moment, Jamal realized something important. He had changed. And maybe, just maybe, that was all that mattered. The weight of that meeting with Marissa stayed with Jamal long after he left the cafe. It lingered in his chest like a dull ache, a reminder that some wounds didn't heal as easily as others. It wasn't the conversation with her that troubled him the most, but the overwhelming realization that what she said was true. She hadn't been malicious, she hadn't meant to destroy him, but her fear, her ignorance, had been the weapon that had torn through him. And he couldn't ignore the fact that it wasn't just her. It was everywhere, woven into the fabric of his world. Every subtle glance, every slight, every assumption made based on nothing but the color of his skin. The world wasn't built for people like him to thrive in it. The world was built to break people like him. He didn't want to feel that way. He didn't want to carry the bitterness, the heaviness that seemed to grow inside him every day. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that, despite everything his mother had told him, despite all the lessons he'd learned about strength and survival, this unrelenting, pervasive hatred wasn't something he could just will away. He had to find a way to live with it. And that was the hardest thing of all. Jamal didn't know how to process the anger that was welling up inside him. He had always been the quiet one, the one who kept his head down, who tried to be the bigger person. But now it felt like he was drowning in a sea of his own frustration. Everywhere he turned, he saw it. The way people would cross the street to avoid him. The way they held their bags tighter when he walked by. The way they looked at him like he didn't belong, like he was something dangerous, something to fear. And he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep pretending that it didn't hurt, that it didn't eat away at his soul. One night, a few days after the meeting, Jamal found himself sitting in his car, parked by the same park he had visited the week before. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the empty playground. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something was about to change, but he wasn't sure if it would be for better or worse. His thoughts were a tangled mess, but one thing was clear: he was tired of being afraid. Tired of playing by rules that didn't apply to him. Tired of being afraid of his own reflection. As he sat there, lost in his thoughts, his phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen, surprised to see a name he didn't expect: Officer Davis. His stomach turned. The officer who had arrived that day at the park, the one who had taken Marissa's side without question. The one who had treated him like a criminal before even hearing his side of the story. Jamal's fingers hovered over the screen, his heart pounding. He had been trying to push the entire incident from his mind, but it seemed like it wouldn't let him go. He answered the phone, trying to mask the tightness in his voice. "This is Jamal." There was a pause on the other end, followed by the officer's voice, deep and measured, almost apologetic. "Jamal, it's Officer Davis. I need to apologize." The words hit Jamal like a punch to the gut. Apologize? After everything that had happened? After he had been falsely accused, humiliated in front of the police, after he had been left feeling less than human, as though he was disposable? He could feel the anger rising in him again, that familiar fire burning in his chest. But he didn't let it spill over. "Not yet." "I don't want your apology," Jamal said sharply. "I don't need it." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. He could practically hear Officer Davis's hesitation, his discomfort. "I understand. I just wanted you to know that. I know now that I didn't handle things properly that day. I should have listened to you. I should have given you a chance to speak. I made assumptions, and I was wrong." Jamal's grip on the steering wheel tightened. His jaw clenched. The weight of those words, coming from someone who had been so quick to judge him, felt like a bitter pill to swallow. What did it matter now? What did it matter that the officer had come to terms with his mistakes, when those mistakes had already cut him to the bone? "I'm not your lesson to be learned, Officer Davis," Jamal spat. His voice wavered with emotion, a mixture of disgust and exhaustion. "You don't get to walk back into my life and make things right with an apology. You don't get to just erase what you did. I've had to live with the consequences of your actions every day since that moment." Officer Davis's voice softened, filled with an almost helpless regret. "I know. And I'm sorry for that. But I wanted you to know that I've taken this seriously. I've started going through training, looking into my own biases. I'm working on it, Jamal." The words were meant to reassure him, but they didn't. They only made Jamal feel smaller, more invisible, as though the world was patting him on the back for the lessons he had forced them to learn. The world had wronged him, and now they wanted to make it right? It didn't work like that. You couldn't just undo the damage that had been done. You couldn't just erase years of fear, of suspicion, of being looked at like you were less than human. It didn't work that way. "I don't care about your training," Jamal said, his voice cracking despite himself. "I don't care if you take 100 classes or go to therapy. It doesn't change the fact that you didn't see me. You never saw me. There was another long pause, and for a moment, Jamal wondered if the officer was even still on the line. Finally, Officer Davis spoke again, his voice small, almost defeated. "I wish I had seen you. I wish I could go back and do it all differently." Jamal's chest tightened. His hand trembled on the wheel. The words hung there, in the air between them, unresolved. And for a brief moment, Jamal wondered if it would ever be enough. Would it ever be enough to make people like Officer Davis see him for who he truly was? Or was he destined to remain a ghost in their eyes, a phantom they could never quite understand? The silence stretched between them, but Jamal didn't answer. He couldn't. There was nothing more to say. Nothing that would change what had already happened. "Goodbye, Officer Davis," Jamal said quietly, before hanging up. As the phone call ended, Jamal sat in his car, staring out at the empty park. The weight in his chest felt unbearable, but there was something else, something different, that was slowly pushing its way to the surface. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if the world would ever change. But there was one thing he understood now: he didn't need them to see him for who he was. He knew who he was. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. He didn't need an apology. He didn't need forgiveness from people who would never truly understand. What he needed was to keep moving forward. To keep surviving. To keep fighting, not because the world was asking him to, but because he refused to let it define him. Jamal started the engine of his car, pulling away from the park. The sun had set, but the night ahead felt different. He wasn't sure where he was going, or what would happen next. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was moving towards something better. Even if that something was just his own peace. And maybe that was enough. For now. The days that followed the conversation with Officer Davis were filled with a strange mixture of peace and unrest. Jamal found himself drifting through his routines with a sense of detachment, like he was watching his own life from a distance. There were moments when he felt like he was finally moving past the weight of his past, but then something, a passing glance, a comment overheard on the street, would pull him right back into the pain. The world, it seemed, wasn't ready to let go of its prejudices. And no matter how many times he tried to push the anger aside, it came rushing back, as persistent as the waves crashing on a shore. It was a Friday evening when the real test came, a night that would change everything. Jamal had been invited to a gathering at a friend's apartment, something casual, just a few people getting together to unwind after a long week. It had been a while since he'd hung out with friends, and though he wasn't particularly excited, the idea of distracting himself for a few hours seemed appealing. As he walked up to the building, his mind wandered back to his mother's words, how she had told him that the weight of the world could either break him or make him stronger. She had encouraged him to find his voice, to find a way to let go of the anger, but still, part of him wondered if he would ever truly be free. The door to the apartment opened as he rang the bell, and his friend Jordan greeted him with a smile that immediately made him feel welcome. "Jamal. Glad you could make it, man. Come in, everyone's already inside." Jamal nodded, his nerves already starting to settle as he stepped inside. It wasn't a huge gathering, just a few familiar faces, friends from college and some new acquaintances he didn't recognize. But he felt a slight knot in his stomach as he scanned the room. There were people laughing, talking, the clink of glasses, the hum of casual conversation. But something in the air felt off. Jamal couldn't pinpoint it, but it was there, like a flicker of unease just beneath the surface. He found a spot near the window, leaning against the wall, and tried to ease into the conversation. He laughed when they laughed, nodded when they spoke, but something felt out of place. It wasn't the people around him, it wasn't even the setting. It was him. The way he carried with him, the quiet rage, the knowledge that no matter how much he tried to fit in, he was always an outsider. He had spent so much time trying to blend in, to be just another guy at the party, that he had lost sight of who he was. And now, it felt like he was suffocating under the mask he had so carefully constructed. As the night wore on, a familiar face walked into the room, Marissa. Jamal's heart skipped a beat. It was the last person he expected to see there, the last person he wanted to see. She looked out of place, as though she were trying too hard to fit in, her eyes scanning the room nervously. For a moment, Jamal froze, not knowing what to do. Should he leave? Should he confront her? Or should he just let it go and let the night unfold? Before he could decide, Marissa spotted him across the room. Her eyes widened, and she took a small step forward, hesitant, like she wasn't sure if she had the right to speak to him. Jamal could feel the tension in his chest rise, but he forced himself to stand his ground, to not back down, to not let her have the power to affect him again. "Jamal," she said, her voice quiet but tinged with regret. "I didn't expect to see you here. I wasn't sure if you'd want to be in the same room with me after everything." Jamal took a deep breath, trying to steady his pulse. He hadn't anticipated this, hadn't expected Marissa to show up here, in his space, surrounded by people who had no idea what had transpired between them. There was something almost cruel about it, like she was testing him, testing how far his forgiveness would stretch, how much of the wound she had inflicted could heal with a simple apology. But Jamal didn't want to go there. He didn't want to revisit the past that still stung. He had tried to put it behind him, had tried to move on. He wasn't sure if he was ready for another confrontation, another attempt at explanation. But there she was, standing in front of him, as though nothing had happened, as though the trauma she had caused him had faded into some distant memory. "I didn't think it mattered," Jamal said, his voice low, almost harsh. He wasn't sure where the words were coming from. Maybe from the hurt. Maybe from the anger he was still struggling to contain. "But I guess it does. Because you're still here. And I'm still here. And you want something, don't you?" Marissa looked down, her hands wringing together nervously. "I don't want anything. I just wanted to see you, Jamal. I wanted to tell you that I'm sorry. I know that's not enough, but I needed you to hear it. I've been thinking about what you said, about how everything that happened with the police. I see it now, the way I hurt you. I didn't even think about it, I just reacted." Jamal clenched his fists, trying to hold back the rush of emotions. He felt torn. Part of him wanted to scream at her, to lash out, to make her feel the full weight of what she had done to him. But another part of him, the part he was still learning to understand, wanted to hear her out, wanted to see if there was any sincerity behind her apology. "You think saying sorry fixes it?" Jamal asked, his voice trembling. "You think that just because you say it, everything's okay? I can't forget what you did. I can't forget how you used me to make yourself feel better, how you called the cops on me like I was some criminal." He shook his head, the hurt bubbling to the surface. "It doesn't work like that." Marissa's face crumpled. The tears were back again, this time spilling down her cheeks in a way that seemed so real, so raw, that it almost caught Jamal off guard. He didn't want to feel sorry for her. He didn't. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. But seeing her so broken, so vulnerable in that moment, it felt like something shifted. Not in a way that would erase the past, not in a way that would make him forgive her, but in a way that made him realize just how human they both were. Both of them, flawed and broken, carrying the weight of their own mistakes. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't know how to handle it. I thought I was doing the right thing. But I wasn't. And now I see that. I see it." Jamal stared at her for a long time, the anger slowly draining from him, replaced by a heavy sadness. He had spent so much time wishing for retribution, for some kind of justice, for her to understand the depths of what she had done. But now, in this moment, he realized that no amount of apologies, no amount of regrets, would change what had happened. He wasn't sure what he expected from her. He wasn't sure what kind of resolution he thought he needed. But this wasn't it. It wasn't enough to heal the wounds that still ran deep inside him. But there was something else, a sense of closure, a sense that he didn't need her to fix this for him. That was the most important thing. "I hear you," Jamal said softly, looking her in the eyes. "But I can't be the one to fix this for you. I can't carry that for you." There was silence between them for a long moment, and then, slowly, Marissa nodded. "I know. I understand." Jamal turned away, feeling the weight of the room pressing in on him. As he moved toward the door, he glanced back at her one last time. She was standing there, her shoulders hunched, her face wet with tears. But Jamal didn't feel anger anymore. He felt free. For the first time in a long while, he felt free. Free of the need to prove anything. Free of the need to hold on to the hurt. Free to move forward, even if the world wasn't ready for him. Because in the end, it didn't matter what they thought. What mattered was what he thought of himself. And that was something they could never take away. As he stepped out into the night, the world felt just a little bit lighter. And that, he realized, was enough. The wind was cold as Jamal stepped out into the street. The city skyline stretched before him like a jagged horizon. The noise of the world swirled around him, the honking of cars, the distant hum of conversation, the pounding of footsteps on the pavement, but somehow, it all felt distant. Like he was suspended in time, hovering just outside the chaos, breathing in the air that had been so heavy with his pain for so long, but now tasted different. It tasted like freedom. It tasted like possibility. His heart was still beating fast from the confrontation with Marissa, the rawness of it all still lingering in his chest. But it wasn't the same kind of pain that had driven him to despair before. No. This was something new. This was the weight of years of rage, years of injustice, all coming to a slow, steady release. And as it left him, he felt the clarity of his own strength, the quiet power that came from no longer needing the world to see him, but simply to be. He had spent so long feeling like the world owed him something, that people owed him something. But now, standing there in the middle of the city that had tried so hard to break him, he realized something profound. The world didn't owe him a damn thing. He owed himself everything. And with that, everything started to change. Jamal walked forward, his pace slow but purposeful. Each step felt like a declaration. Each footfall was a promise to himself, to never let the past define him, to never let the pain of others carve away at his soul again. The world might not have been fair, it might never be fair. But the one thing that no one could ever take from him was his own power, the power to rise from every blow, to stand tall despite the odds. And it was in this moment, walking down this cold, empty street, that Jamal realized the truth. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was thriving. The phone buzzed in his pocket, but Jamal didn't flinch. He didn't need to check it. He didn't need to see who it was. He had learned enough. He had learned that the world would always try to define him. It would always try to label him, categorize him, place him in a box to make it easier to dismiss him. But he was no one's label. No one's idea of what he should be. He was Jamal. He was whole. He was everything they said he wasn't. He was everything they tried to break. And they could never take that from him. Not ever again. Jamal turned the corner, the city lights gleaming above him, each one a star in his own personal constellation. He had spent so long feeling invisible, like his existence was nothing more than a shadow in the background of someone else's story. But now he knew. He wasn't a shadow. He wasn't a background character. He was the protagonist of his own story. For the first time in a long time, Jamal smiled. It wasn't a smile of triumph or of arrogance, but a smile of pure, unapologetic peace. A smile that came from within, from a place so deep inside him that he hadn't even realized it existed until now. And then, just as he reached the intersection, he saw it. The city, the world, the universe, all of it, unfolded before him. He had spent so much time running, so much time fighting, so much time angry. But now, for the first time in his life, Jamal could see the truth. It was all unfolding perfectly. He was unfolding perfectly. Jamal didn't need the world to change. He didn't need people to apologize. He didn't need anyone to see him in the way he had once hoped for. He had done the work. He had healed. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The world would never be perfect. It would never be free of pain, of prejudice, of hate. But Jamal had found his own way to live in it. He wasn't just existing in this world anymore. He was owning it. And for the first time in his life, Jamal truly believed in his own power. Not the power given by others, but the one that lived inside him. The strength to keep moving forward. The strength to forgive, even when it seemed impossible. The strength to love, even when love seemed so hard to find. The strength to rise above. As he took another step into the unknown, the wind whispered through the trees, as though the universe itself was urging him onward. And Jamal? He walked forward without hesitation. Without fear. Without regret. Because he knew something the world didn't, no one, nothing, could ever break him again. He was free. And nothing could stop him now.